875.M41. Day 75. Warp time variance approximate. Gideos is dead. I wasn't there when it happened. Warren was. He was covered in brains when I arrived in the scrying chamber. That was all that was left of poor Gideos after he heard the mortis cry. God Emperor only knows what happened to the rest of him. Something terrible is occurring on Zartak. The astropath attached to the Saint Angelica swears by it. He seems to be a venerable psyker of some experience, yet even he was half mad and bleeding from every orifice when I saw him last. No wonder young Gideos popped the way he did. What could have caused a soul shriek of such horrific power? We're going to be the first to reach Zartak. I'd still rather be doing this than playing mediator back on Kelliston, though. My thoughts go out to Rochfort. His duties there will teach him patience, if nothing else. Signed, Interrogator Orgim Nzogu.
Membank entry log ends. Thought for the day. Every day survived is one day closer to the day of your final rest.
Chapter 4. Amon Kull stepped into the Centrum Dominus of the Precinct Fortress, boots disturbing the pool of blood that had spread across the floor. The lumen strips were back on, lighting up a scene of carnage. It brought a smile to the prince's thin lips. Shenzar and his Terminator brethren had always taken a commendably direct approach when it came to butchering cattle. The control center's staff lay scattered haphazardly across the floor, or draped across their stations, bodies blown apart by point-blank combi-bolter fire, or reduced to a wide splattering of gore by the blows of power fists, mauls, and lightning claws. Kull's weakening of the Void Shield had allowed the veteran Night Lords to teleport directly into the Precinct Fortress's nerve center. It had always been the best way, Kull thought. Rip out the heart, and everything dies. The sounds of bolter fire reached him from elsewhere in the fortress. A few more rats being blasted from their holes. Behind Kull, First Kill stood in silence. Their own blades and armor still bloody from the night's work at the Void Shield generator. "You took prisoners for our Talon, brothers?" Kull asked Shenzar, who was now standing in the shadows at the edge of the Centrum Dominus.
"Of course, my prince. They have begun to nest in the primary chapel. They seem content, for now."
"And the garrison commander?"
"Also alive. He is in the chapel. His thoughts are being flayed by the Talons even as we speak."
"We will need him alive should we require more falsified Imperial communications," Kull said. "In the same way we used the ship's captain."
"I will visit him personally, to ensure the Talons do not grow too restless with his flesh." "The astropaths are dead,"
said Shadraith. Kull had not been aware of the sorcerer's arrival, but he had long ago stopped showing any surprise when it came to the Flayed Father's silent manifestations. "How loudly did they scream?" Kull asked, not deigning to look at his old mentor. Instead, he bent to inspect a cogitator view screen, cracked by the shrapnel from a bolt that had taken off a dead Imperial's arm.
"Loudly enough,"
Shadraith said.
"It will have disturbed the mind of every psyker in the nearest systems. They will not be able to fully ascertain the source until we have long gone. Zartak's one tie to the Imperium has been severed."
"Then we can begin," Kull said. He gestured to Shenzar. "Signal the last breath. Have thralls from the bridge brought down here. These systems will need repairing. They can take whatever parts they require from the Imperial truth. And find more prisoners for the Talons. We must slake their thirst until we need them. If we need them." Shenzar's horned helm nodded once. Kull returned his gaze to the view screen. The brutal firepower of Shenzar's Terminators had left much of the room's equipment damaged. The vast screen bank occupying one of the center's upper tiers would need to be repaired. Roughly a third of the monitors that recorded the footage from the pict feeds throughout Sinkshaft 1 were cracked or blank. The remainder showed the Warren-like interior of every single prison cell, hanging cage, and mining subshaft on a constant, shifting loop. Kull took a moment to stare at the mute, grainy black and white activities of the thousands of inmates. The vast majority were still locked to their shackle bunks. Many were staring at their cell hatches, or seemed lost in angry or panicked discussion. All had heard the shrieks of First Kill as they slaughtered the defenders of the Void Shield, and many would have caught the sounds of gunfire echoing from the Precinct Fortress. Kull wondered if they understood that their salvation was at hand. He suspected at least one did. "My prince, the override systems have been secured," crackled the voice of Kale, leader of the Fifth Claw, over the Vox. and the rest of my claw are in position. Good, Kull said, eyes still on the prisoners. Release them. The alarms had switched off as abruptly as they'd started. Skell's ears ached. He shifted in his bunk, trying to slow his breathing and force down the sickly sense of dread that filled his guts.
What now?
Dolar asked.
I don't know, Skell said. I don't know what's happening.
But he did know. Not in a definable sense, not in a way that he could explain, but he understood. They'd come for him, just as the voice had said they would. The things that had terrorized his dreams had manifested into reality.
I heard gunfire, Dolar said slowly. From above.
They'll have killed the lawmen, Skell said.
Who are they?
I told you. I don't know.
Dolar shook his head. A buzz made them both jump. There was a thud and a clatter as their magnicals deactivated and fell away. They looked at each other. Dawn shift was still at least an hour away. Nobody was ever auto-unchained during night cycle.
What?
Dolar began, but got no further. With a squeal of hinges, their cell hatch ground open, its locking system remotely disengaged. For a second, everything was silent. Skell stared at the open hatch, at the walkway beyond, and the far side of Sink Shaft 1 beyond that, separated by the plummeting chasm of the shaft. The cell hatches and hanging cage grates across from them were open too. Every single one, lining the dozens of levels of the circular prison, had been unlocked. He heard the first whoops, swiftly melding together into cheering that echoed up and down the shaft. Jared, Gloff, Roland, and Pyets, the occupants of the cells either side of theirs, were yelling their own delight. Nedzi and Hollis in the cell below were leaping with excitement. They were free, all of them, and that realization terrified Skell more than anything else that had happened that night. It was chaos. Sink Shaft 1 housed almost 100,000 penal convicts. When Kale of the Fifth Claw cracked the Precinct Fortress's locking systems and automatically opened their cells and cages, every single one saw hope for the first time in a long time. The fear and uncertainty that had settled over the prison mine like a shroud was snatched away in a few moments of stunned disbelief. Tens of thousands of inmates made their bid for freedom. Few stopped to think about what was happening. The realization that others were seizing the moment drove them all out of their cells and cages and onto the walkways ringing the inside of the mineshaft. For a few mad, precious minutes, it looked as though the greatest penal breakout in the history of the segmentum was underway. The killing began almost immediately. The walkways hadn't been constructed to take the whole of Zartak's primary prison population at the same time. Men were thrust out over the railings and into the abyss of the shaft, whether by design or simply because of the press of frenzied, grimy bodies. Their individual screams were easily lost in the uproar now reverberating from the towering sides of the great pit. Others were grabbed and flung over the edge, as gang rivalries reignited and old scores were swiftly settled. With not a lawman in sight, the mob made for the surface. The grav lifts had all been deactivated, so they packed the stairways. Those on the highest levels, who had been first out of their hanging cages, swiftly regretted their haste. At the top of each flight, they discovered a single figure waiting, a giant, armored in lightning, as immovable as the arbitrator statues that flanked the adamantium gatehouse of the precinct. That was when the real killing began. Jark's Eighth Claw laughed as they opened fire on the crush that filled the stair shafts. Their bolters annihilated the foremost prisoners, blasting scrawny, dust-caked bodies into steaming chunks of meat and bone. The thunderclap report of their weapons hammered down the shafts, deafening and disorientating those behind as they continued to push upwards. The Night Lords added the sounds of the recorded sufferings from past victims over their vox grills to the screams of those being cut down, creating a sonic assault that filled Sink Shaft 1 with echoes of purest terror. Some prisoners snatched makeshift weapons, breaking open tool crates or picking up chunks of mine debris. It made no difference. Those prisoners in front tried to go back, while those behind, not knowing where the sounds were coming from, tried all the harder to push forwards. Men were crushed and trampled, their bodies broken against the rockcrete walls or plasteel rungs. The Eighth Claw, the youngest and bitterest in the whole warband, began to advance, firing as they went. In Stairwell 819, Jagan disobeyed orders to conserve ammunition and opened up with his flamer, cackling maniacally over the vox as he flooded the shaft with liquid fire. In Stairwell 75, Korvax drew his chainswords and leapt into the fleeing prisoners with an ear-bursting roar.
His revving weapons and armored bulk tore, eviscerated, and crushed everything he touched, smashing dozens of bodies back down the way they'd come. It was a massacre, and it was just the beginning. The sounds of slaughter reached Skell and Dolar as they reached the walkway beyond their cell hatch. Convicts were scrambling past, yelping and jeering, still unaware of what was happening further up the sink shaft. Dolar was dragging Skell by the collar of his grey overalls.
We got to go!
The older inmate shouted over the tumult. When the cell hatch had first slid open, Skell had stayed rooted to his shackle bunk for what felt like hours. Eventually, Dolar had hauled him to his feet.
You're acting crazy, Skell! Let's get out of here!
Dolar, we can't! Just trust me!
Yeah, we can! I ain't staying!
By the time the monsters made it to the bottom of the stairs and into Sinkshaft 1's prison complex, the tide had finally turned. Even the most desperate of the former prisoners had realized that something terrible was descending from above. They stampeded in the opposite direction, like a grox herd driven wild by the scent of a predator. The only way out was down.
Not the stairs,
Skell said, as they were carried along by the press. He planted his hand on Dolar's shoulder, urging strength into his command. Dolar's eyes became glazed as he pushed and shoved at those around them.
They're all dying up there,
Skell said.
Into the mines, now! Skell!
Bawled a voice. It was Argrim. Skell half-turned in the press to see the big smuggler gesturing at him from half a dozen yards back. Ruddy face contorted with anger, his short red hair spiked with sweat and grime.
You little runt!
He shouted.
I'm coming for you, witch!
Dolar, move! Skell ordered, impelling him again. Dolar drove himself forwards into the flood of bodies, single-mindedly forging a path for Skell to follow. Argrim and his accomplices, the wiry kleptomaniac Relly, and the one-eyed gangland enforcer Soren, were left struggling angrily against the wild, dirty tide.
Take a left,
Skell ordered, hands still on his cellmate's back. Dolar stumbled but kept going, turning through a mine subway hatch instead of carrying on towards stairwell 10-1. Abruptly, the press of bodies receded. If they wanted to stay alive, they had to stay ahead.
Go for the rat holes,
he told Dolar. The convict was stumbling, shaking his head. The effects of Skell's willpower were wearing off, and he didn't have the strength to drive another spike of determination into Dolar's mind. His own skull was throbbing more painfully than ever, and his nose felt blocked.
Why are we here?
Dolar moaned.
Why are we going down?
Because they're killing everyone who's going up, Skell said. Just follow me. He took the lead. The mine subsurface was one of the primary routes into the main works, a trio of loco rail tracks that acted as an arterial lane for the numerous mines that branched away from Sinkshaft 1's prison cell blocks, cages, and oubliettes. It was broad and high, packed with sturdy girder ribs, studded with devotional seals and bright, hardwired lumen orbs. It had been built by the original colonists, a far cry from the borough's shabby, dilapidated outer workings. Skell took Dolar past the dusty servitor-manned loco rail carriages, and on down the tracks, their feet crunching in the gravel. The uproar reverberating through the sink shaft gradually faded, until all they could hear was the buzzing of the lumens, their footfalls, and heavy, panting breaths. Eventually, the slowly curving tunnel revealed a rock-creek platform. Skell clambered onto it and helped Dolar up after him. The dust-caked yellow block letters over the entrance read Submine 16. Masks, Skell said, unhooking one of the rudimentary filtration kits from the rack next to the entrance. The microscopic adamantium dust that shrouded the lower works was deadly. Iron lung killed more of the penal workers each production cycle than all the machine accidents, cave-ins, and gang murders combined. Skell buckled the respiration mask in place and took a slow, sucking breath. The stink of old rubber and someone else's stale sweat invaded his senses. He tossed a second mask to Dolar.
Hurry,
he said. He was trying to act confident, trying to look as though he knew what he was doing, trying to pretend his hands weren't shaking and his body wasn't slick with cold sweat. He felt sick. He could hardly breathe through the mask's cloying, sucking embrace. Dolar fitted his mask in place and followed Skell as he pushed through the plastic flaps and into the submine tunnel. Here the work started to become less permanent. The cutting had a single track for hauling raw adamantium ore up to the rail line. The beams that supported the walls and ceiling were scarred plasteel, and the lumen orbs were intermittent and dim. The devotional texts and daily reminders that perforated the more established tunnels were now few and far between. Dolar slowed as their footing became less certain.
We have to keep going,
Skell urged him again. We don't have much time. As though to underscore his words, sounds echoed down the tunnel from the way they'd come. Screams and gunfire.
Keep going,
Urged the thought that was not his own. He pushed Dolar on.
They took a left!
Argrim shouted, shoving Soren and Relly through the mine hatch.
I saw the big oaf's head above the crowd!
The sounds of screaming and gunfire were getting closer, and suddenly sticking with the mob didn't seem like such a good idea. Argrim had made a career from following his gut, and right now that instinct was telling him to break from the pack. Besides, when had Skell's predictions been wrong before? Wherever he was going, that was where Argrim wanted to be. It was quiet in the subsurface tunnel. The convicted smuggler scanned the idle loco carriages they passed, wary of an ambush. He'd underestimated the boy yesterday, and not for the first time. He wouldn't do so again.
Got a trail,
Relly said, gesturing at the gravel between the track lines. 2 sets of footprints led off down the subway tunnel, side by side. Argrim nodded.
Let's go.
Carl watched the carnage on the undamaged view screens, fighting the urge to descend into the sinkhole and join the unrestrained bloodshed. Around him, thralls from the last breath were laboring hard to refit the rest of the viewing bank, attending to the snapped orders and tech psalms being intoned by one of the ship's hooded heretics.
It is time I address the cattle,
Cull said to the dark Mechanicum priest overseeing the installation. The cowled figure nodded, its flesh-webbed mechadendrils recoiling back from the Prince of Thorns. The Night Lord held out a gauntlet, and the creature passed him a voxhorn. He raised it to his helm, and paused to take a breath.
Murderers or Zartak, thieves, traitors, blasphemers, blackmailers, smugglers, and recidivists. Brothers, rejoice, one and all.
Cull's voice was broadcast via the Precinct Fortress's uplinks across the automated systems of Sinkshaft 1, the cutting words of the Night Lord echoing through Vox bays, over intercoms, and across Labor Gang work channels. Rejoice, for we have come for you, the 8th Legion, the Night Lords, sons of Conrad Kurz. We are the instruments of your liberation. Even now, the last of the corpse-worshipping lapdogs who have suppressed and maltreated you are being slaughtered. You are free men once more, at liberty to do whatever you will. He paused for a moment, letting the echoes of his voice fade away through the planet's dark underworld. In return for your liberty, we ask only that you show us your abundant talents. House Cull's 12th harvest has begun. We seek the greatest among your ranks to join us in the long war against the false Imperium that has enslaved you. Strength, power, riches, immortality. We offer it all, and more. Now is the chance for the true killers to step forward. Now is the time for the strong to take what is rightfully theirs. We shall be watching. Cull nodded, and the heretic cut the link. He returned his gaze to the view screens. Driven back by the butchery unleashed by 8th Claw, the hordes of escaped prisoners had turned from the stairwells and were instead pouring into the mines of the burrow, flooding it like a sea of blind, mangy vermin. Cull felt satisfaction flare. It would soon be time for the next phase. Shadraith's sibilant voice interrupted his thoughts, and he grimaced.
I take my leave,
said the sorcerer.
The boy is somewhere below, attempting to flee. I can feel it. He must be found.
As you will, flayed father, Cull said, not turning from the flickering display screens. Once you've retrieved him, bring him here.
I will,
Shadraith replied, casting a lingering glare at Cull's back.
Of that, you can be sure.
Dolar wouldn't go any further. Skell cursed him. If we stop, they'll catch us, he snapped. His cellmate just shook his head, eyes wide above the seal of his respirator mask. He was terrified. They'd made it as far as Burrow Shaft 28. The claustrophobic dirt and rock corridor was one of hundreds of close mining seams, a long, low space scarred by decades of las cutters and pickheads. It was the edge of the burrow. The only thing that dug further and deeper were the rat holes, crawl spaces exploring the earth for the few remaining untapped strips of adamantium far below the planet's surface. Skell could hear sounds behind them, bouncing weirdly down the narrow spaces of the mine. Footfalls and voices. Voices he recognized. Argrim had followed them, Either his hatred for Skell eclipsed his desire to escape, or he simply understood that if Skell was going the opposite way from everyone else, there had to be a damn good reason why. Skell reached out towards Dolar, who recoiled and pressed himself against one of the timber frames supporting the tunnel. Skell grimaced and pushed into him. His head ached. He was tired. He tried to marshal his thoughts. "We're going," he said, gesturing further along burrow shaft 28.
No,
Dolar stammered.
didn't you hear what that voice on the speaker said? They can see us. They're watching. If we try to escape, they'll know.
Skell snarled with frustration and punched Dolar's chest. The blow did nothing.
Skell!
The shout came ringing down the tunnel. He turned and saw silhouettes framed against the brighter lights of the submine. He recognized the voice.
Where in terror's name are you going, witch?
Argrim demanded, striding towards them. His two lackeys crowded close behind. All three stooped over in the tunnel's confines.
What's going on up there? Tell me!
"Stop them!" said Skell. Dolar hesitated. Skell snatched him by the throat.
Stop them!
He screamed, driving the words into Dolar's dull mind. The convict flinched and cried out, throwing Skell back off him. Then he turned and launched himself at Argrim.
Deal with his pet!
The smuggler ordered his two underlings. They lunged past Argrim and grappled with Dolar, trying to pin him up against the tunnel wall. Argrim thrust past them, eyes glaring murderously over the seal of his respirator. Skell ran. The lighting in the burrow shaft was almost non-existent. He stumbled through the semi-darkness, the sound of Argrim's footfalls gaining on him. He could hear Dolar grunting as he fought, and then his shouts as he realized he'd been abandoned. Skell didn't look back. Argrim caught him, snatching the back of Skell's overalls and making him stumble. The smuggler's scarred fists struck at his shoulders and dragged him back against the wall, thrusting him into the packed dirt.
Little mutant twist!
Argrim spat, and smacked his fist into Skell's stomach. The scrawny boy doubled up, the air driven from his lungs. He clutched instinctively onto Argrim's sides as he sought to keep his feet and find his breath. The smuggler flung him back against the wall, derisive now.
You not got much fight in you without your big boner, do ya?
He snatched Skell's greasy black hair, forcing him to look back up the tunnel. Argrim's two dregs were murdering Dolar. The simpleton was too confused and terrified to fight back. One of the attackers had salvaged the metal haft of a broken pick. Dolar took a good half-dozen hits before he fell. Shame and anger rose up inside Skell, choking his rattling breaths.
Where are your witch powers, freak?
Argrim sneered, turning him so they were face to face. The smuggler's blunt, scarred features contorted behind his mask.
Time for you to join your idiot friend,
he said, raising his fist. With a yell of rage, Skell snatched at him. Argrim froze. Skell's eyes flared, alive with strange, burning light. His yell became a feral snarl.
Your soul is mine now, Willem Argrim!
Skell's grip tightened impossibly, and the bones in Argrim's hand snapped with a wet crunch. The flood of pain coincided with a flood of nightmarish images driven into the smuggler's mind. Argrim started screaming, and didn't stop. Skell released him, and he collapsed onto his knees, face contorted behind his mask, eyes staring into nothingness as his mind was ravaged by the horrors of a patchwork monster of dead skins. Skell left him, and began to walk back down the tunnel. The two minions had stopped beating Dolar when their master's terror started to echo through the tunnel. Now they simply stood and stared at Skell as he approached, rooted to the spot. Dolar lay face down at their feet, unmoving, blood from his split skull seeping out into the dirt. The witchlights playing about Skell's eyes flared, and he shot out one hand. Lightning ignited at the gesture, crackling from the boy's fingers. A boom of displaced air hammered down the tunnel as the bolt earthed itself into the body of the nearest of Dolar's killers. It struck the metal of his pick haft first, dancing up his arm and across his body. His screams joined those of his master, and then his accomplice added to them as the lightning arced between the two men, striking them both. They stood transfixed. Their overalls ignited, then their hair. Their eyes burst from their skulls. Their skin melted from their bones. By the time the lightning released them, they were nothing but blackened, badly cooked offal. The two hunks of meat collapsed to the tunnel floor, steaming. Argrim was still screaming, his throat raw. Skell paced towards the dead bodies. One of them still clutched the pick haft, his hand now a shriveled, blackened claw. Skell stooped and snapped it free. It was sticky with Dolar's evaporated blood. His broken skull gleamed in the dim light of the flickering lumens. The body twitched. Sparks of electricity leaped and danced up the haft and writhed around Skell's forearms. He turned and walked back to Argrim. The smuggler was finally silent, left curled and whimpering in a fetal position. The white fires in Skell's eyes had dimmed. He felt dazed, detached. He stood for a moment over Argrim's cowering form, the broken haft held loosely, energy still snapping and sparking in the air around them. He shook his head. His nose was bleeding, making it hard to breathe through his respirator. He glanced back at Dolar's corpse, and then down at Argrim. His expression hardened, and he lifted the pick haft. Kull watched the harvest over the view screens of the Centrum Dominus, his jump pack unclamped and laid at his feet. He was seated in the command throne brought down from the Bridge of the Last Breath. The pale lighting of the view screen banks flickered and broke across his dark armor, gleaming from its metal thorns. Jark's Eighth Claw had driven the escaped convicts back from the surface stairwells. Obeying their primitive mob instincts, the humans had turned en masse for the only other route available to them. Instead of going up, they went down into the burrow, the warren of hundreds of mines and shafts, which worked outwards from the central sink like a network of earthen capillaries. Most headed to the loco rail lines, hoping to eventually make it through to the works of the sub-precincts and secondary mines that dotted the rest of Zartak's surface. They would find no succor there. All the sub-precincts bar one had already fallen to the 4th, 6th, and 7th claws, dispatched to strike the Imperials garrisoning them while the Vox network was still down. The single remaining sub-precinct and mine work held by the arbitrators was only resisting because Kull allowed it to. He had plans for that particular garrison. His gaze lingered on a view screen showing the silent black and white bloodshed occurring in a section of the burrow labeled Incline Shaft 6. 2 gangs of prisoners, each a dozen strong, were setting upon one another with fists and scavenged mining tools. It hadn't taken long for the massive escapees to degenerate into murderous rival packs. Kull always found the behavior of humans fascinating when their social hierarchies were subverted or broken. If Zartak's convicts had been able to rally around a leader and coordinate a push towards the surface at multiple stair points, they would almost certainly have been able to overrun Jark's inexperienced but bloodthirsty claw and reach the jungles beyond Sinkshaft 1's perimeter. Instead, they acted with no more forethought or ability than base animals. Freed from their shackles, they fled in blind, screaming panic from any threat they perceived greater than their individual ability to overcome. The stronger took revenge or vented their own terror upon the weaker. Old gang groups reasserted themselves. The chaos of freedom made everyone an enemy, an opportunity a snare. It was in such situations that the strong thrived, when humanity was cut back to its very basics, when it was thrust into an inimical environment and surrounded by fear and threat. It found itself reduced to a purer, more primal state. The weaker gravitated to the protection of the strong, or they were destroyed. The Night Lords had affirmed what Kull had always believed. The only law was the knife's law, and the only right belonged to those able to take it. Kull had that right now. He had missed that from his own childhood. Adopted by the ruling nobility, he had gazed from their towers at the slums below and wondered where his real parents were. Why had they abandoned him? What criminal lives had they led? Were they still alive? He'd never found out, and he never would. The people of his home world had been butchered a century before, both his real and his adoptive parents dying together. The latter had been flayed in their palace, while the virus bomb unleashed by Shadraith had killed the former. When the 8th Legion had come, the hierarchies of privilege and class had meant nothing. That was part of the reason Kull had deactivated the void shield of his false father's palace. He had known instinctively that these invaders would not spare the old regime that had made his life into a monotonous lie. He could never have imagined just how right he was. The bloodshed in Incline Shaft 6 was over. There were 4 survivors, now busy scavenging whatever they could from the corpses. One of them was injured, limping. As Kull watched, the other 3 cornered and killed him as well, before carrying on out of sight of the picked monitor. Kull remembered how they'd killed the weakest of the aspirants when he'd first started his inductions. The Night Lords hadn't told them to, but they'd done it anyway. Kull had slit the throat of a boy with a sprained ankle one night, in the bowels of the Last Breath. Shadraith had singled him out for praise. He'd always favored him. That in itself was a test. It had made the other aspirants hate him. Kull had realized that, though. He'd moved to kill each of them in turn before they could corner him. Shadraith had approved. Without the sorcerer's patronage, he knew he wouldn't have risen to the position he now held. He resented that fact. Soon, he would change it. Shadraith had become too enamored with his demon, Bargul. Killing those who were a liability was a vital part of the warband's survival. Blood's loyalty, as the Night Lords called it, only went so far. Such long war sentiments had no place in his warband. He blink-activated his helmet's vox.
Fexrath, he said. Is the Void Shield Armory open yet? Affirmative, my prince, the third claw leader replied. The garrison was well stocked. A pity they didn't get a chance to use any of it. Well, let's make sure someone does. I've seen enough of this stage. Begin distributing the weaponry. As you wish, my prince.
Kull broke the link, satisfied with his decision. Just as things were starting to settle into a steady cycle of killings and low-key gang clashes, the Night Lords would tear it apart and start again. By the time the harvest was over, only the strongest would remain.
Gene scan complete. Access granted. Beginning Membank entry log. Date check. 3636875.m41.
Day 76. Warp time variance approximate. I have pulled what Carto files and historical slates I could concerning the penal colony on Zartak. It wasn't much. The limited ability to access central data on board the St. Angelica is hardly ideal, but all the same, there should be more here. It looks as though some older files have been wiped. When last surveyed, Zartak was a jungle planetoid, formerly designated as a cross-tithe Deathworld penal colony by the Adeptus Administratum. It is the single largest supplier of raw adamantium in the entire subsector. The whole rock is riddled with the stuff, or at least it was before the miners hollowed it out. Most of the works are offshoots of the original sink shaft that's now used to house the prisoners. The primary Adeptus Arbites precinct fortress sits above it, defended by a void shield. There are smaller sub-precincts and lesser works scattered across the rest of the surface, all of them connected by a system of subsurface loco rails and access tunnels. The historical slates are far less comprehensive. They reference a number of prison riots and uprisings, all of them suppressed. There are some references to colonists before the rock was formally designated a penal colony. I will investigate further while we are in transit. Signed, Interrogator Orgim Nzogu.
Membank entry log ends. Thought for the day. The simplest way to destroy the future is to forget the past.
Chapter 5. The bridge of the White Moor was a sepulchral place. Like an ancient palace lost beneath the tides, its carved coral walls and pillars reached towards a high vaulted ceiling that shimmered with the light of the ancient vessel's energy shields. Silence hung across it like a shroud, disturbed only by the quiet hum of cogitators, the chiming of augurs, and the distant throb of its engines. Many of the pale-robed serfs manning the bridge's data pits had had their vocal cords surgically removed in a zealous effort to imitate those among their masters who had taken the void vow of silence. The only time that silence was truly broken was during warp re-entry. Earlier, the rock-like walls and worn deck plates had resonated with the urgent canting of the transitional choir and the buzzing of cherubim as they flitted overhead swinging their auto-sensors. The Space Marines occupying the bridge had joined the chanting, slipping into the high Gothic plainsong with experienced ease. The ship had shuddered and moaned with otherworldly fear as it ripped itself from the coruscating madness of the warp, tearing back into real space like an oceanic predator thundering up from the depths, surrounded by a halo of fading, clawed light. The Augur arrays were still chiming with results as the White Moor probed its new surroundings. The fuzzy, incomplete sea-green display of the Zartak system that beamed up from the holochart in front of the British command throne was slowly resolving. Either side of the White Moor were 6 escort ships, clustered like minnows beside a leviathan, scenting the waters for blood. Only the ragged distortion of the system's great asteroid belt lay between them and its only occupied world, Zartak. And to Shah, home, or at least, once home. Only the thinnest slivers of the penal colony remained embedded in his memory. The cold, the darkness, muscle ache, despair. They remained imprinted on his psyche, long after true recollections of his life as a convict had disappeared. Shah felt his anger stir. None of that mattered anymore. The angels of death, the Void Father's anointed, had come for him. He had a new life now. Whoever that boy had once been, 2 centuries ago, he was long dead.
We're 4 hours out from high orbit,
he said, seeking focus in the familiarity of the tactical briefing.
Initial scans indicate there is only a single vessel currently anchored above the planetoid. We're still running identification, but it would appear there was a recent orbital engagement. We're reading macro-cannon discharges and what may be a wreck caught in the gravitational well.
Across the display from Shah, the rest of the Third Company's command structure listened. Chaplain Nikora brooded in his black battleplate, while Taika Harangi leaned heavily on his bone staff, flanked by the strike leaders of the company's individual squads. Kahu had deliberately positioned himself away from the others, next to Shah. The Terminator had donned his helm, its snout painted with the gaping red maw that contrasted so powerfully with the off-white plates of the rest of his tactical dreadnought armor.
Vox transcripts seem to imply Imperial communications on the planet's surface have failed,
Shah continued. A click of a rune inset into the Hollow's control panel, highlighting Zartak on the 3-dimensional display.
Beyond a distress signal beamed from a minor installation on the southern hemisphere, there appears to be no contactable Imperial presence on the surface. There may still be survivors underground.
The Night Lords do their work swiftly, Strike Leader Omeka 39 Ari, commander of the company's scout attachment, muttered. Do we have confirmation that they are the ones responsible for this? Chaplain Nikora demanded.
Nothing beyond my scrying,
Taika Harangi said before Shah could answer.
But I've never seen clearer portents. They are here at the bidding of the Kirimate, the Dead Skin, and its demon master.
If you've seen it, then that's enough for me, Nikora said, his skull helm nodding.
It doesn't seem that our initial plan needs to be changed,
Kahu said, voice grating from his Vox.
Secure a landing zone and hunt the traitors into the mines. If they release the prisoners, it will only hamper their efforts to hide.
If the facility sending the distress signal still resists, then that will become our base of operations,
Shah said.
If not, we will retake it and make it so. All of Zartak's precincts are linked via underground subsurface lines and foot passages. Holding one will provide us with access to the rest. From there, we will work our way into the primary mine and flush out the traitors.
Seize the void shield generator, and my red brethren can teleport into the main precinct and cut off their head,
Kahu said.
That is surely where their master is hiding.
Or it could be a trap. We know these traitors too well. Shadows and trickery are their way.
And destroying them is not all we need to consider,
Taika Harangi added.
I request the use of Strike Leader Ari's initiates to help look for the boy. He is already loose somewhere in the primary mine workings. My visions have shown that the Dead Skin is hunting him.
There was a whir of servos as Kahu shifted his stance.
We surely cannot afford to lend you our full complement of scouts, Chief Librarian,
the Terminator said.
But we shall, nonetheless, Shah said. Even with his abilities, the venerable Chief Librarian cannot be expected to scour the whole mine alone. Better that than sparing fully fledged Void Brothers to look for the child.
The tithe,
Kahu began, but Shah cut him off.
Will be completed, he said, and the boy retrieved, for the chapter. At the moment, there is no reason to suspect either of those objectives is beyond our grasp. Once we have made planetfall and initiated contact, I will reassess the situation. Until then, the scouts are at Taika Harangi's disposal. Is that clear?
The assembled Karkaradons nodded silently, although Kahu only did so after a moment's pause. Shah caught Taika Harangi's eye and noted his silent thanks. Kahu might demand obedience to Tyberos and the wider edicts of the chapter, but Shah had known the Chief Librarian long enough to trust his judgment. Whoever the boy was that Taika Harangi sought, his talents meant he was of vital importance. Rannick managed to pop the release rune on the restraint harness before she was sick. A flood of bile splattered the cracked inside of the Salvation Pod's crystal flanks viewing port and drenched the rudimentary control panel. The arbitrator managed to stumble out of the open rear hatch before a second wave of nausea hit, driving her down onto her knees amidst the furrowed dirt. She stayed crouched for a long time, dry heaving, watching the contents of her stomach seeping into the scorched trail of earth plowed by the pod's landing. It began to rain, the sound of millions of droplets hitting the canopy around her creating a hissing, pattering susurration. Zartak's sun was rising above the treetops, leaching color back into the blackness beneath the boughs of the planetoid's jungles. As the rain began to run through the joints in her battered armor, she forced herself to rise. The mud underfoot was already a cloying quagmire. Her vision swam, and she held her arms out to steady herself. She drew in a long, slow breath, feeling her stomach finally beginning to settle. She'd come awake in the middle of re-entry. The Salvation Pod's viewing port had been a red blaze of atmospheric flame. She'd been convinced she was going to die, not knowing what to do, trapped in her harness. The fires had faded, and the clouds had parted, and the undulating green sea of Zartak's treetops had rushed up to greet her. Even with the last-second launch of the dampeners and the restraint harness on full lock, the impact with the surface had nearly snapped her spine and broken her neck. Her body ached, and that wasn't even counting the injuries she'd sustained on the Imperial Truth. It was a struggle just to stay upright. She glanced back at the Salvation Pod. Its black surface was scarred and steaming, half buried in jungle muck. Behind her, a trail of shattered bark, shredded leaves, and sap-oozing splinters marked where the pod had made contact with the canopy, dragging itself 100 yards through the jungle. She wondered how, in the God Emperor's name, she was still alive. It was thanks, she knew, to the nightmare creatures. That knowledge made her stomach clench again. Their attempt to seize the Imperial Truth and the ambush which had followed had been entirely planned. That much was obvious. What had turned the former prison ship into a living nightmare wasn't so clear. Rannick had never encountered anything like the things that had fallen upon them from the shadows of the bridge. If she hadn't known better, she'd have said they were some sort of dark parody of the tales she'd heard about the god warriors of the Adeptus Astartes. They were creatures of the dark gods, though. That much was certain. The whole of Zartak was in grave peril. A solid click-click made her freeze. She stood in the rain, hair plastered to her scalp, shivering. A voice barked at her. "Turn around!" She did so unsteadily, to find herself staring down the barrel of a trio of Vox Legis. 3 arbitrators stood at the edge of the Salvation Pod's dirt furrow, the rain glistening from their black helmets and carapace plate. Rannick tried to speak. Instead, she collapsed, slapping into the mud. Her vision spun. She was half aware of the arbitrators approaching, weapons still leveled. "Sub-Precinct 12, she managed to slur. One reached down and grasped the pauldron of her armor with a lock glove. He rolled her onto her back and slapped the mud from her breastplate, revealing her blocky yellow ident tag. "Sub-Warden Rannick," the man demanded, face unreadable behind his helmet lens. Rannick managed to nod. "Welcome back to Zartak, sir," the arbitrator said, maglocking his shotgun to his backplate. He grasped Rannick's hand. His 2 comrades took her by the shoulders and hefted her up out of the mud. "We saw your re-entry," said the arbitrator. "We were dispatched from the sub-precinct to investigate. First Arbitrator Jackin thought it may be hostile contacts." "What sub-precinct?" Rannick managed, struggling to focus on the 3 men's own ident tags. "Where are we?" 8, sir," the arbitrator said, putting his arm under Rannick's back to support her. "Clean's jurisdiction. We're just 2 kilometers southwest of the outer bastions." "Is Clen there?" Rannick asked. "Have you heard anything from the Precinct Fortress or the Warden Primary?" "Negative, sir. The last we heard, he was at the fortress attending a session review. Comms went down about 2 hours ago. We haven't been able to raise anything. The shock squads were being deployed to an unsecure vessel in high orbit. Then everything went dark. I'm guessing that's where you've come from, sir." "It was a trap," Rannick said. "Not a prison riot. Something has taken over the ship." "Something?" "We need to get to your sub-precinct, arbitrator. Help me." Supported by one of the 3, they made their way through the drenched jungle, following the blips on a handheld Auspex. It was slow going. The rain turned the undergrowth into a quagmire and reduced dips and channels into fast-flowing, muddy streamlets. Soaking fronds and creeper vines clawed at them. The arbitrator on point unclamped a machete from his mag plates and started hacking through the more obstructive sections of the green. Rannick felt sick. Her skull was throbbing from the hit she'd received on the bridge. She tried not to think about any of it. Tried not to think about the tortured body of Captain Van Hoyt, wired up to his own Vox system. Tried not to think about how the midnight-clad giant had killed Macran with a single blow. Tried not to question why it had not only spared her life, but returned her to Zartak's surface just south of a sub-precinct. Were they already here? On the surface? The sun was fully up by the time they stumbled into the Killzone clearing ringing Sub-Precinct 8's bastions. The central keep rose above them. A squat, thick blockhouse of black rockcrete. They passed the desiccated skulls staked out along the tree line, the remains of those convicts who'd attempted to escape, now serving as a warning to others desperate enough to want to switch the mines for the jungles. 8. This is Recon Team 1, the arbitrator supporting Rannick said into his Vox talk. We are entering the kill zone. Medicate to the south gate. They began to slunk through the rain-slashed mulch that surrounded the sub-precinct. They were halfway across when a boom echoed from the jungle behind them. The leg of the arbitrator supporting Rannick exploded just below the knee. They both went down, the arbitrator screaming. "Contact! Contact!" shouted a voice over the Vox. "The tree line! Covering fire! Now!" There was a rattle as the arbitrators manning the south bastion opened up with their autoguns, hard rounds zipping over Rannick's head. She managed to get up onto her knees, glancing behind her. There was no sign of whatever had shot the arbitrator. The wounded man was writhing in the muck, clutching at his bloody stump. The sight of the injury sent a jolt of adrenaline through Rannick's body. "Help me with him!" She snarled at the other two. She snatched the man under one arm, while his comrade took him beneath the other, and together they began to haul him towards the plasteel gate. The third arbitrator slammed a few long-range shotgun blasts into the tree line before joining them in the sprint for the gatehouse. Just a dozen yards away, there was another boom. The skull of the arbitrator helping Rannick burst, splattering the sub-warden's bare head with steaming grey gristle. She collapsed in the muck next to the headless corpse. The wounded arbitrator was still screaming, bleeding out fast from his severed limb. "Move it!" Rannick heard a voice shouting. "Get them inside!" The sub-precinct's gate had rolled open. Half a dozen arbitrators thumped out into the rain, weapons ready, joining the blind fusillade that was still hammering from the bastion top. Hands grasped at Rannick and the injured arbitrator, hauling them both into the bastion's gatehouse. The final member of the recon team joined them. With a thud, the plasteel doors slammed shut. Rannick regained her feet and put out a hand to steady herself. She was panting. The arbitrator who'd led the team out from the gate had the yellow warning chevrons of an NCO stamped onto his black breastplate. He was speaking into his Vox talk. "Wall units, if you don't have a visual, cease fire." The shooting stopped. The wounded arbitrator had stopped screaming too. A Medicae had jabbed a throwaway syringe packed with stims into his thigh and was now busy tying off the injury. Rannick cuffed blood and rainwater from her eyes. She was shaking. The arbitrator with the stripes looked at her. "Sub-Warden Rannick, I'm First Arbitrator Jackin, acting commander of Sub-Precinct 8 in the absence of Sub-Warden Clem. With all due respect, sir, I would like to yield that responsibility to you." "Accept it, First Arbitrator," Rannick said, speaking automatically. "You'll have to brief me. How many men do you have garrisoned here?" "We are all going to die," her thoughts screamed. "-4 here, and Pollock out there in the mud. 2 squads of 10, sir. And 5,000 inmates in the mines below. We've been on full alert since the Voxnet went down." "Are the inmates shackled?" "Every one of them, sir, and their manacles are ready to blow at the first sign of trouble. Seal off the subways as well. Make sure nothing can get in or out via the underground." "Understood, sir." "What exactly is going on out there?" "Your guess is as good as mine, First Arbitrator," Rannick lied. "Whatever it is, it's bad news." "How did you get off that ship?" Jackin asked. Rannick forced herself to face the man down, trying not to let her fear and uncertainty show. "It's classified. If you need to know, I'll tell you." Jackin didn't look away, expression inscrutable behind his helm's visor. Eventually he nodded. "Of course, sir." Rannick turned her back on him and let out a long, unsteady breath. Shuttle engines screamed as a trio of gunships circled Sink Shaft 1, the dawn sunlight glinting from their scarred, void-worn hulls. They hovered above the precinct fortress for a while like scavenger bills, scenting the humid air thermals of the jungle for fresh meat. They found it in the fortress. One by one, they dipped their wings and dropped off, alighting with an ungainly thud of stabilizers and landing prongs inside the precinct's landing bays. Hatch ramps clanged down on the rockcrete, and spiked combat boots clattered out of the bays. The Black Hand had arrived. Fexrath and his third claw met them. The squads of cultist infantry were directed first to the Void Shield armory block. There, they swapped their old weaponry for freshly stamped Adeptus Arbites autoguns and shotguns, wasting no time in taking serrated combat knives to the Imperial insignia on the stocks. The Black Hand had started out as an experiment by Fexrath, one which Kull had approved. Harvest aspirants didn't always perish during the trials, and with the warband forever low on resources, Kull had been loath to kill otherwise able recruits. Fexrath had volunteered to cultivate the most vicious survivors into infantry capable of undertaking tasks the warriors of the 8th Legion would not normally have dirtied themselves with. The Black Hand were the result. Cultist foot soldiers dedicated to the sadistic narcissism that surrounded the warriors of the 8th. The weapons not scavenged from the precinct fortress by the cult soldiers were crated up and, still accompanied by the baleful presence of Third Claw, shunted down into the burrow. As the Black Hand spread out into the mines, those convicts they came across who didn't flee were gunned down. It was their misfortune. The Black Hand were only seeking to give out gifts. Once they'd penetrated far enough into the mines, the crates were unlocked, opened, and abandoned. The Black Hand returned to the precinct fortress along with their masters. Only Shadraith stayed behind. The advice of Bargul's shadow minions had brought him to a subsurface tunnel leading off from one of the stairwells. It had been one of the first places the flood of convicts had turned to when 8th Claw had dissuaded them from the routes to the surface. It was littered with dead men, stripped of everything bar their overalls. In their frenzied desperation to escape, many had simply been crushed to death, and those who had passed by had looted them of whatever they'd scavenged. Finding a trail amidst the trampled bed of the loco tracks would have been impossible for even the most skilled mortal hunters. But Shadraith had immortals on his side. The shadows whispered to him, coiling and darting ahead like eager bloodhounds. They were forever flitting in the corner of the sorcerer's eye, vanishing whenever he tried to focus on them. They were the nightmares that lived on in memory after sleep departed, and they had the scent, the warp scent. In days past, the voice of Bargul itself would have guided him, but the trickster demon was being infuriatingly distant now. It had been clear enough. Only by tracking down and initiating the boy could Shadraith renew their millennia-old pact. With the demon's soul bound to a strong mortal's flesh, nothing would stop them. Submine 16. Shadraith passed into the hollowed-out tunnel, his dark, ethereal familiars muttering their encouragement. The bodies were fewer here. The convicts had filtered through the ever-expanding maze of the burrow like scum through sluices, the packed masses of the upper levels disintegrating into smaller gangs, groupings, and desperate, roving individuals. The shadows snatched a few of those unwary loners as Shadraith passed, rending and consuming them in a frenzy of insubstantial black talons and flapping wings. The Chaos Sorcerer paid no heed to their antics. He was getting closer. He could sense it. The warp fires that topped his scythe, grown dormant since he'd massacred the Precinct Fortress's astropaths, were flickering with life once again. The shadows chittered, excited by the return of their master's favor. The Night Lord pressed on, into the bowels of the great mine workings. Inside a section marked as Burrow Shaft 28, he discovered what he'd hoped to find, bodies bearing the touch of the Immaterium. There were two, hideously burned, their blackened remains shriveled. To Shadraith's witch sight, the corpses still smoldered with the many-colored shades of warp fire. The third body was untouched, its skull split open. "The boy's friend," hissed the demons that clustered around Shadraith. He nodded. The bodies were still fresh, their souls only recently fled. The boy could not have gone far. The sorcerer carried on down the shaft, forced to stoop. For now, the boy was almost wholly unaware of his latent psychic abilities, blind to the power that made him shine like a beacon in the depths of the Immaterium. His subconscious had clearly repressed his psychic strength as a means of self-preservation, reducing his gifts to so-called tricks or bouts of luck. It was well that it had, or else the black ships would have already come for him. Shadraith could offer much more than the enslavement, torture, and sacrifice demanded by the Imperium. Once he had the boy in his grasp, he would unlock his abilities and make him realize his full potential. whether he wanted to or not. Then he would have an apprentice worthy of his skills, and Bargle would have a powerful host on the material plane. The demon had been clear. All he had to do was get to the boy before the pale nomad. Skell clawed his way through the dirt, his sobs echoing down the packed rat hole. There wasn't room to stand. The main section of the seam had to be crawled through on hand and stomach before it widened out once more into the larger works of the neighboring sub-precinct mines. That was where Skell had been trying to get to, hoping to either find some sort of order amidst the chaos or just lose himself in the darkness. He would gladly have taken his prison cell in the Magnicals over the shadow-haunted underworld he was lost in. He'd taken an old lumen lantern from a bracket at the entrance to the rat hole. Its flickering light was now his only companion, and he was certain the shadows were encroaching on its little sphere with each passing second. His shoulders scraped against the hole's sides, and after a while, he had to push the lantern through the cold, wet dirt in front of him, forced down by the suffocating space. He kept going, trying not to think about the claustrophobic walls or earth pressing in on him. He could still hear Dolar's shout, when he had realized Skell was abandoning him. The dreadful noise echoed through his thoughts along with Argrim's screams. The smuggler's blood was a dry, brown crust on Skell's fingers, and he had nothing to wash it off with. He remembered the wild panic of being pinned against the tunnel wall and beaten, and the horror of seeing what the other two were doing to Dolar. He'd gone blind for a second, and when his vision had returned, it hadn't been his own. Weird images had imposed themselves on his retinas, like the aftershock of a bright flash that left behind spindly, multi-limbed ghosts of radiant light. He'd heard cackling laughter echoing madly around the corridor of dirt. It had been like a dream, except when he'd awoken from it, Argrim and his accomplices were dead. Only a lingering memory of exhilaration and unbridled aggression had remained imprinted on his mind. There was something coming for him. He had to get away before it found him. The route he was taking, the one he'd once worked with Dolar, Nedzi, and the rest of their labor gang, had been blocked off. At some point, part of the rat hole had collapsed. After 20 minutes of squirming desperately through muck and darkness, Skell had come up against a solid wall of packed dirt and broken timbers. That was when he gave up. A part of him had known this day would come. He'd been having the dreams and waking visions since the Snatch Squad had taken him on Fallowrain. He'd said nothing of the terrors except to Dolar, and even then, only when he'd realized that he needed his brute strength if he was going to survive life in the penal colony. Now he'd lost even that. He was going to die, or worse. Another bout of sobbing broke out and echoed away down the rat hole. This time, someone answered. A thought intruded into his mind. It was not a separate voice, not the sibilant death rattle that increasingly spoke to him in the darkest hours of the night. It was subtler, more of a suggestion. Certainly alien, but not wholly invasive.
Keep going,
it urged. I can't, Skell said, cuffing his nose. It's coming for me.
You still have time. If you stay, the shadows will catch you. Double back now.
Skell tried to obey. He tried to force his tired limbs to work as he pressed through the cramped semi-dark, pushing with elbows and knees to force himself back down the rat hole. It was slow going. He dragged himself without thinking, as though the suggestion in his mind had spread to the rest of his body. An otherworldly willpower that compelled him to action. It was at once a distressing and comforting sensation. The presence had none of the jagged bitterness that accompanied his visions of fanged shadows and leering skulls. It was not devoid of threat, but its malice was not directed at Skell. Whatever it was, it didn't want the shadows to claim him. Right now, that was all that mattered. Eventually, he collapsed out of the hole and into the submine shaft he'd entered from, his body burning with exertion, covered head to foot in cloying grey muck.
Make haste,
the thought said.
You are stronger than you know.
Fear drove Skell up, blanking out the pain in his limbs. He stumbled off down the corridor of earth, in the opposite direction from the route he'd taken. He'd left the lantern at the rat hole's entrance, but he didn't look back.
Have faith, Skell,
said the thought.
Have faith, and keep running.
Behind him, the lantern flickered once, and died. Shadraith stopped. He let out a thin, hissing breath from his helm's vox grill. Around him, The shadows froze as though caught in the middle of some illicit act.
He is here,
said Bargle. The sorcerer shuddered at the sound of the demon's voice slipping around inside his skull.
You have not spoken in long enough,
he replied, his tone barbed. The grip on his warp scythe tightened.
I have not had good reason to,
the demon snarled back. The warp light wreathing Shadrath's scythe flared, and the shadows cringed back in fear.
Do not so easily forget all I have done for you, demon,
Shadrath snapped.
You would do well to recall that you are not my master, and neither are you mine, Night Lord. The boy is escaping. The pale nomad will do anything to retrieve him. You must take him and properly bind him so that I might have a house of flesh to reside in.
The sound of distant gunfire echoed down the tunnel to Shadrath. He turned his head towards the noise, his prey sight stripping away the darkness.
The harvest is progressing, he said. Kull has supplied the prisoners with weapons. If a trap is to be set, then it must be done now. We need the pale nomad's warp-blessed blood to complete your summoning. Go,
Bargle urged him.
My will is with you. He will not evade you for much longer. About that, at least we are agreed,
Shadrath said, setting off once more. Around him, the darkness sprang into scuttling, squirming motion, picking up the warp scent again. This time, there would be no escape. Sinkshaft 1 resounded with reports of gunfire, las and hard rounds. The cracks and bangs echoed up and down statue-lined tunnels, transitways, and haulage shafts, and coalesced like a continually reverberating thunderclap in the central pit. The prisoners had found the weapon crates hauled down by the Black Hand from the Arbitrator armories. It had taken less than an hour for the more powerful gangs to descend on the equipment like flocks of flesh carrion on dead meat. Now suitably armed with the Aquila stamp weaponry of their former masters, they were busy enforcing a new code of law on Zartak. Might made right. Kull watched the various running battles across the view screens of the precinct fortress. They were invariably close-ranged, bloody, and brief. The side with the element of surprise always won. Only at a subsurface rail turning point, where a savaged group of escapees from the lower blocks managed to hole up in a stationary loco carriage, did anything approaching a stalemate develop. Kull grew bored watching the standoff, and sent one of Fexrath's Claw brothers to murder the inept Savlar who'd failed to wipe out their prey with their first strike. Such incompetence was of no use to him. The slaughter between the freshly armed gangs was intense. Those who hadn't yet managed to pilfer any weaponry stood no chance at all. Soon, there would be no unarmed inmates left on Zartak, and the next phase of the harvest could begin. Kull turned his attention to the progress in the sub-precincts. Reports from the Three Claws dispersed among the planetoid's lesser penal facilities indicated everything was still going according to schedule. The convicts of the secondary and tertiary mines were being herded aboard loco carriages in preparation for transport to Sinkshaft 1. After the inmates of the primary facility had been fully harvested, the second wave would follow the first. By the dawn of Zartak's next long day, the selection process would be nearly complete. The chiming of auger systems disturbed the Night Lord's thoughts. The holochart near the middle of the command center flickered into static washed life, new signifier runes overlaying themselves across the map of Zartak and the surrounding space.
My prince,
began one of the heretics, newly assigned to the command center's sensor systems. But a gesture silenced him. Kull knew. They were here, and right on schedule. Gene scan complete. Access granted. Beginning Membank entry log. Date check. 3641875.M41. Day 78. Warp time variance approximate. There was definitely something untoward about the fate of the original colonists of Zartak. Ship cargo returns show at least 3 vessels. New Hope, Providence, and Pilgrim's Road were all chartered to transport settlers there. The last records I can find detail their arrival and the founding of the site that would become the primary mine, Sinkshaft 1. But after that, everything has been erased. Right up to when a new charter issued by the governor of the Attica subsector authorized the Adeptus Arbites to work with the local hive worlds to turn the pre-existing mines into a penal labor colony. By then, the original free colonists who constructed the first works seemed to have no longer existed. Who deleted the files detailing the fate of those first colonists? And what became of them? I pray I can find the answers to these riddles before we reach Zartak. Signed, Interrogator Orgim Nzogu. Membank entry log ends. Thought for the day. A mind free of guilt is a mind devoid of memory. Chapter 6. The Carcharodon Astra made ready for war. Where other chapters would have prepared themselves to the sound of oath cants or warlike boasting, the Carcharodons did so in silence. The fore armory was filled. The entirety of the 3rd Battle Company roused from their slumber or returned from their vigils in the White Moor's long, lonely corridors and substations. The murky air was filled with the grate of battleplate and the whirring of servos, as the armory's thralls and artisans bedecked the 79 Void Brothers in their war glory. Shah flexed his gauntlet, watching the intricately inscribed ceramite digits respond in perfect sync. He had memorized the chief artisan's analysis of the millennia-old armor during the weeks of transit. He was aware of the minute lag in the servos of the right leg, that the targeter in the helmet's left lens occasionally failed and reset itself, and that the bonding-studded left pauldron had been fitted with a lower grade of plasteel than the rest of the suit. Such was the nature of the chapter's ancient, reconstituted war gear. Wearing it for the first time, he was also aware of how the armor's spirit differed from his old suit. The battleplate of the Reaper Prime was redolent with what Shah could only describe as an underlying, ever-present hunger, not much removed from the savage appetites experienced by the chapter's initiates when their gene changes first set in. Shah was beginning to understand why Company Master Akia had pursued such direct, savage tactics in the final operations before his death. The need to kill emanated from the war gear. It was the blindness made manifest, a byproduct of the chapter's complex genetic heritage. Shah donned his crested great helm, allowing its autosenses to link with his own. They seemed to do so only with reluctance, unwilling to accept their new master. Shah shook off the unsettling thought. He wondered at how much the shark and scythe crest on the helmet's left temple mirrored the fresh tattoo on his own flesh beneath. Regardless of who had come before, he was now the Reaper Prime. He was now commander of 3rd Company. "Strike Leader Ari," he said, testing the helm's vox vocalizer. The scout commander turned from where he was ranking up his carapace-armored initiates and bowed his head in salute. "Are your initiates prepared for their latest blooding?" Shah asked, casting his eye over the assembled scouts. Their appearance was becoming increasingly uniform. They were all shaven-headed, while their skin pigmentation had grown noticeably paler and their irises darker. Some of the older ones had begun to sharpen their teeth in imitation of the full Void Brothers they aspired to be, while 2 had even earned the right to their first exile tattoos. All of them had seen at least one blooding before, and many were on the cusp of full initiation. The fact brought home how vital a fresh tithing was. The chapter needed a new generation of inductees. "They are ready, Company Master," Ari said, casting his black gaze over his charges. Many were still visibly shaking from void sickness. For a second, Shah was reminded of his own days as an initiate, after the Nomad predation fleet had plucked him from Zartak's depths. His grim smile was hidden by his helm. "That is well, Strike Leader. You will report to the librarian with them. The Venerable Te Kaharangi has a special purpose for this tithing." Ari bowed his head once more, and repeated the motto of the 10th Company. "As you command, Company Master. First in, last out." Company Master. The title still rang hollow in Shah's mind. How much longer would it continue to do so? Would he ever shake off Akia's blood-red shadow? Across the armory, the squads were completing their preparations and departing for the launch base. Other commanders would have taken the opportunity presented by the assembly to deliver some sort of oration, but that had never been the chapter's way. Every Void Brother had been issued with detailed sets of operational and strategic briefings, environmental overviews, and opposition analysis. They all knew why they were here and what was expected of them. They would do their duty to the chapter, the Void Father, and the Shade Lord, regardless of what Shah said to them. That in itself was a blessing. He didn't want to have to stand before them in Akia's battleplate before it had been bloodied, before he'd proven that he was worthy, to himself as much as to them. He keyed his vox. "First squad, to me." Around him, his retinue gathered. There was familiarity in their presence at least, a degree of comfort. Strike veteran Dorthor, with his ancient chain axe maglocked to the side of his backpack. Apothecary Tama, who'd upheld a vow of silence for almost a century. Red Tane, the company champion, who carried the coral shield and the void sword, both ancient Terran relics that had been with the chapter since the very first day of exile. Brother Soha, and his ancient Volkite caliber, newly promoted from second squad to fill the gap left by Shah's own promotion. Signifier Nico, who was reverently lifting the company's ragged banner from its place upon the armory wall. All bore the red arrow-tooth marking in the center of their helmet visors. They were all red-scarred, the badge of true veterans. They had been his battle brothers for more years than he cared to count. He owed each of them his life many times over, yet he couldn't help but wonder if they too still saw Akia when they looked at him now. "Report to Bay 5, brethren," he told them. "I must conduct a final briefing on the bridge. I will join you once we reach high anchor." "Is it true, Company Master?" Tane asked, hand resting on the hilt of the sheathed void sword. "Have the traitors reached the Tithe World before us?" "We shall know soon enough," Shah said. "But whether they have or not makes no difference. The Red Tithe will go ahead. We will make sure of it." He dismissed them. The halls and corridors of the White Moor shuddered as he passed through them towards the bridge. The ancient strike cruiser's weapons batteries were lit, hammering the surrounding space with relentless ripples of macro-cannon fire and lance strikes. The fleet was passing through the system's asteroid belt, and the barrage was necessary to clear a path and break the frozen rocks before they could do any lasting damage. The strike cruiser's shields were sufficient protection against the millions of splintered fragments that impacted against it, though occasionally the ship's internal lighting would dip after a particularly vicious strike. The squad leaders had assembled once again on the bridge for the final approach briefing. Shipmaster Teko was monitoring the effectiveness of the White Moor's defensive barrage from the gunnery station as Shah entered. The green illumination of the diagnostic view screens and oculus stands casting his gaunt, white features into sharp contrast. "Still no trace of the traitor's fleet elements?" Shah asked, as Teko acknowledged him with a bow. "None, Company Master. Though our augurs won't be able to complete a full scan until we're clear of this damned asteroid field. The only vessel on our displays is the penal ship, Imperial Truth." "The traitor's main fleet will be concealed. It's how they fight. They cannot have crippled the system's communications by any means other than subterfuge. The fleet must remain on its guard. Once we have made planetfall, their most likely course of action will be to separate us." "We will hold station. Have no doubt," Teko said. "The traitors would require a grand fleet indeed to threaten us." Shah knew the shipmaster was right. The vessels belonging to the Third Company, like all sections of the Carcharodon's nomad predation fleet, were a mismatch of old and heavily modified classes and capabilities. The White Moor itself was, at its most basic levels, a venerable Exile-era Tyrant-class capital ship. The original design had been both rebuilt and expanded down the centuries. New engine blocks, plasma recycle systems, triple adamantium bulkheads. The White Moor was a patchwork monstrosity, its capabilities more akin to the battle barges of more standardized chapters. Her 6 escorts likewise displayed the broadest range of class variations imaginable, from the retrofitted sword frigate Grey Harvest to the Crusade-era Rothhammer Void Revenant. More than half of the fleet had been in service since the first day of exile, that dark time when the wandering ancestors had been banished from their homeworld and the ranks of their brethren, and ordered out beyond the galaxy's edge. Whatever the traitors possessed, they wouldn't have been able to conceal sufficient numbers or firepower to threaten the White Moor and her company. "What of communication with the surface?" Shah asked Teko. "Have you been able to lock down the distress signal?" "Not yet," Teko replied. "We'll have a better chance of making contact once we reach high anchor. Local area logs list the signal as being emitted from a minor Adeptus Arbites facility tagged as Sub-Precinct 8. We've not been able to ascertain whether or not the garrison is still holding out, or whether the signal is simply running on loop.
Whether it is or not, we need a base of operations, Kahu interjected. It's in an optimal position to provide us with subterranean access to the precinct fortress and the primary mine network. Capturing it would be an excellent starting point.
And that also makes it the perfect trap, Shah said, turning his attention to the massive Terminator. We know that these traitors delight in setting all manner of snares. They lure the unwary or the overconfident to their deaths, or worse.
Spring their trap, and they will have nothing more to threaten us with,
Kahu pressed.
We require a base to operate from if we are to complete the tithe. Let the Red Brethren lead the assault.
First blood should go to the company master, said Chaplain Nakora. It's tradition, especially as this will be his first blooding as Master of the Third. Shah was glad his helm hid his grimace. As much as he hated being reminded of his new rank, Nakora was right. It was both his duty and his privilege to spearhead the Karkarodon's planetfall, and Kahu had just laid down an unspoken challenge. Thrust his hand into the jaws of the trap, or let Kahu do it for him. He knew why the Terminator was doing this. Assessing the situation from orbit and formulating a less risky operational plan would have taken time which Kahu didn't believe they had. The chapter needed its tithe quota. Every day, the war in the deeps was costing the Karkarodon Astra more and more. There had been doubts among the other company masters that it was right to make Shah the new Reaper Prime during such desperate times, but there had been no opportunity to debate the promotion. Teika Harangi's visions had spurred them on to Zartak. He alone seemed to have fully supported Shah's new role, and even then, the aged Chief Librarian's praise was thin. Kahu was testing Shah's dedication to his new role, perhaps on the orders of Tyberos himself. Would he put his life and the lives of his immediate brethren before the chapter's objectives? The answer was clear. Kahu was underestimating him.
I will purge the Imperial truth in orbit, and then lead 1st and 2nd Squads planet side in the initial wave, Shah said, the gaze of his helm's black lenses sweeping over his subordinates. Chief Librarian Teika Harangi will follow with a scout detachment. Kahu and the Red Brethren will man the teleportation chamber and stand in immediate reserve. If contact is lost with me at any point, the chain of command passes to Teika Harangi. Is that clear?
The assembled Karkarodons nodded as one. Shah surveyed the rotating orb that represented Zartak on the bridge's holochart.
Trap or not, he said slowly, I will wager this particular band of traitors have never fought the Karkarodon Astra before, nor will they live to fight us again.
Skell's nose was bleeding. He wiped it with one grimy hand, pausing to try to catch his breath. He was in a haulage shaft, though where he had no idea. The lumen lights rigged to the bare dirt walls flickered. He felt sick with exhaustion.
Keep going,
the thought in his head urged. He stumbled on. Memories rose up. Roax, surrounded by arbitrators pointing at him. The man he considered his father. The one who'd taken him in when he'd fled the Ministorum orphanage and its mad abbot's beatings, turning him over to help save his own skin. The memory of the betrayal made him slow, his tiredness redoubling.
Ignore it,
said the thought.
It's toying with you.
Another memory reared up, fragmentary and instinctive. A hot bowl of nutrient broth for a stomach that ached with hunger. A worn blanket. A warm smile. A gentle kiss on his bruised brow. The face of the mother he'd believed he'd forgotten forever. He stumbled to a halt, sobbing. The thought kept speaking to him, insistent.
It's trying to make you stop. It's trying to catch you. You have to drive it out. And keep going.
I'm alone, Skell said, fighting back the tears. I can't go on. There's no point.
You're never alone, Mika Skell. The Void Father is with you, always.
I don't understand.
You will. Go.
Skell wiped the tears from his dirt-encrusted face and forced himself onwards. The White Moor was cleared for action. The strike cruiser shuddered with barely contained power. The air heavy with the static crackle of its void shields and the throb of charged lance batteries. Shipmaster Teko had taken to the bridge's command throne, surrounded by a blur of holofields and data readouts. The viewing bay's blast shutters had been lowered.
the space beyond now represented on the view screens and Oculus displays that dominated the center of the dimly lit bridge. Shah watched the ship's crew. It was rare for Carcharodons to even notice their enslaved serfs, much less actually note their activities. Certainly, the strike leaders assembled behind Shah were oblivious to the emaciated humans hurrying back and forth around them. Those who manned the White Moors Bridge were the most privileged of the hundreds of thousands of thralls that attended to the nomad predation fleet, their experience and expertise affording them better rations and living quarters. Even so, they were wasted and weak creatures, their grey and white chapter robes hanging limp from starved bodies, their features gaunt. In pale imitation of their masters, they all bore shaved scalps, and some had sharpened their teeth to points. Shah watched them as they worked vox banks and auger panels, monitored engine output, and prepared firing coordinates, all in deathly silence. Try as he might, the company master found he couldn't differentiate between any of them, old or young, male or female. They were the chapter's chattel, their enslavement ordained by the Void Father's will and permissible under the edicts of exile. "Reaper Prime," said Tekko, drawing Shah's gaze to the great coral block that was the bridge's command throne. "We are coming up on the penal ship," the shipmaster said. "Ident scans and the keel tag confirm it's the convict hauler Imperial Truth. What are your orders?" "You've hailed her?" "Affirmative. She is unresponsive. Close-range auger traces have detected only minimal life signs. A shuttle jettisoned from her approximately 10 minutes ago, heading for Zartak's surface. We lost its trajectory on the far side of the ship."
The murderers will already have had their fun, Kahu said. It'll be nothing but a charnel house.
"True," Shah said. "But if there are still prisoners on board, it will be wasteful to destroy the ship from afar. They may be able to provide intelligence before we make planetfall."
The traitors would have broken them,
Kahu said, dispassionately.
Boarding her would be a waste of time.
Shah watched the view screens. Even without picked magnification, the Imperial Truth was now clearly discernible, its blocky, unlovely bulk framed by the swirling green and white orb of Zartak. What had become of her crew? What now festered on board in the darkness that had claimed her decks and holds? "Boarding her isn't a waste of time if it renders up our first tithe prisoners," Shah said. "That is why we are here."
You really do want first blood,
Kahu surmised.
Akia's spirit is strong in you, company master.
"And I will have it, Kahu," Shah said, ignoring the barbed comparison. "Whether on board that ship or on the planet below, prepare 3rd and 4th squads and the Devourers, and prime the Ursus Claws." The Ursus Claws were terrible weapons. White Moor possessed 2, each capable of being launched from its port or starboard flanks. Both were fashioned like vast harpoons, nearly the size of the escort ships accompanying the capital vessel. As White Moor drew alongside the Imperial Truth, sections of its adamantium bulkheads levered back. On Shah's orders, the great barbs launched. The plasma thrusters clustered beneath their tips, blazing. They arced silently through the void, uncoiling link by link as they powered towards their prey. The Imperial Truth was struck 4 of its starboard engine bays and aft of the primary cargo holds. The adamantium tips of the 2 great spears plunged into the vessel's outer shell, plasma drives burning out as they drove the Ursus Claws through layers of reinforced bulkheads, service corridors, and maintenance shafts. Once the tips had been buried, the barbs sprung outwards, hooks the size of super-heavy battle tanks digging into the ship's guts, and lodging there with a flare of magnetic fusion. For a second, the Imperial Truth shuddered, impaled and helpless. Then the Ursus Claws began to pull. Great rotor coils embedded in the White Moor's flank turned, powered by energy diverted from the ship's plasma drives. The links connecting the Ursus Claw tips to their housing in the strike cruiser were dragged slowly taut. Little by little, the Ursus Claws started to retract, and with them, they hauled the Imperial Truth. The prison ship listed, without any propulsion of its own, metal shrieking and groaning as the starboard decks began to buckle. But the Ursus Claws had dug deep. They held. Shah felt the assault torpedo around him shudder as it launched. Behind, First Squad stood unmoving, fully armed and armored, their auto-stabilizers and maglocks keeping them upright as the torpedo blazed towards the Imperial Truth's flank. White Moor had dragged the penal ship in close enough to ensure that whatever defensive systems it possessed would be unable to lock on to the Carcharodon's assault craft as they tore through the narrow void between the two ships. The chrono display on Shah's visor barely reached 15 seconds before the proximity alarms chimed, and the narrow metal troop bay was filled with vicious red light. "Brace!" Shah ordered, setting his stabilizers to maximum. Just as his armor locked, he felt the retro thrust dampening a headlong collision, moments before the impact itself. He grunted, his power armor absorbing the violent gravitational changes. The torpedo seemed to settle for a moment. Then fresh vibrations throbbed through the deck underfoot, as the melters in its prow burned through the Imperial Truth's outer hull. Shah unclamped Reaper. Behind him, he could feel First Squad's desire to kill. They had waited long enough. Shah found himself praying there were no prisoners left alive aboard the ship. Nothing to complicate the bloodshed. His only desire was to slaughter. He thrust the bloody emotions aside, seeking focus. He was not Akia, but he could kill like Akia. The frag plates on the boarding torpedo's prow burst with a dull thud, followed by the sound of autobolts grating back. The troop bay lighting flickered from red to green. Shah was already moving as the ramp fell, Reaper a roaring counterpoint to his deathly silence. Beyond was shrieking darkness. Shah's autosenses picked out misshapen, unnatural forms, further distorted by the fragmentation burst that had shredded the corridor the torpedo had penetrated. Shah's senses reported the unmistakable sickening stench of the warp. The Carcharodon decimated the first demons to rear up at him from the darkness, Reaper tearing them to globules of shredded meat and black ichor. He stamped down on their writhing remains, his sharpened teeth bared with hatred. The malformed horrors would have torn the sanity of most mortals. Even as Shah pressed on, they rose up around him, sucking maws and fleshy appendages writhing and clutching at grey battleplate. Nightmares made manifest. But nightmares meant nothing in the outer dark. Shah cut them apart, Reaper sending gouts of black filth splattering across Akia's armor, across his armor. A surge of revulsion drove Shah on down the corridor, the fury of his great chain axe filling the confined space. The life essence of the squealing, mewling things infesting the ship was soon dripping from him, an unworthy tribute to the Void Father. This was no blooding. It was an extermination, a culling of something vile. The anger only made Shah strike harder. Behind him, First Squad followed in his frenzied wake. Dorthor and Red Tain put down the demon spawn savaged by the company master, single bolt rounds dissolving their unnatural flesh. Tain hadn't even deigned to draw the Void Sword, unwilling to sully the relic blade with demonic ichor. Soha was protecting the squad's rear, his Volkite caliber buzzing with power as he reduced the horrors further down the corridor to bursts of fire and ash, the crimson rays of the ancient weapon illuminating the violent scene with bursts of hellish light. The last demon came apart in Shah's fist, dissolving back into the immaterium. Before him, an access hatch lay open. He shouldered his way through it, scanning for fresh prey, his transhuman body screaming silently for more kills. His autosenses showed him the slaughterhouse he'd stepped into. What had once been the ship's Medicae bay was awash with blood and hung with bloody skins. The insane abattoir was crawling with hunchbacked, cloaked creatures, cultists that cringed away from Shah's presence. The Carcharodon didn't hesitate. He added their tainted blood to the demon ichor spraying from his chain axe, ripping through their squealing forms. They clawed and beat at one another in their efforts to get away from him, helpless before the grey-plated giant. The rest of First Squad simply watched as Shah massacred them.
"No prisoners,"
Strike veteran Dorthor said, assessing the carnage as the last cultist shriek was cut off by Reaper's howl. Shah stood breathing heavily, viscera dripping from his ancient armor. He fought to control himself, fought to master the urge to keep killing, to shed more blood. He was not Akia. He was not. He acknowledged a trio of situation reports on his visor, transmitted from the Devourer assault squads and the 3rd Tactical Squad as they penetrated other parts of the ship.
"No human survivors,"
he said, confirming Dorthor's statement.
"And no sign of the renegades."
"We're missing one boarding party," Signifier Nico muttered. Shah realized he was correct. 4th Squad had yet to report in. Cordy killed while the memories came at him. He had been dreaming, though of what, it was hard to remember. Sun-drenched shingle and crashing waves, perhaps. It didn't matter. What mattered was that he was shedding blood. For the chapter, And the Void Father. Focus. He reloaded, movement smooth, none of his mental turmoil evident in the well-honed actions. He opened fire, his Phobos R/017 bolter joining those of his Void brothers. Fourth Squad had penetrated the base of the Imperial Truth's command spire, their boarding torpedo crushing an access chute. They'd fought their way upwards, through stairwells haunted by horrors of morphing warp flesh and grasping claws. The Carcharodons were splattered with the demon spawn's gore, a foul patina that did nothing to slake the shimmering bloodlust of the Adeptus Astartes. Strike Leader Akara's terse commands were the only thing keeping them in formation, a triple knot of Void brothers advancing one after the other up the stairwells, providing each other with mutual fire support. "Purged," Cordy said tersely, as the demon that had reared at him from the shadows of the stairwell came apart. The tactical marines pressed on, moving with the fluidity of natural-born predators. Teika Harangi was with them. The chief librarian had insisted on accompanying the strike up towards the bridge, presumably drawn by some arcane desire or knowledge. He led Fourth Squad from the fore, the green stone tipping his bone force staff, lighting the dire, warp-stinking darkness that wreathed the ship. More fire came from up ahead. Cordy joined the lead Void brothers as they engaged a fresh mass of spawn infesting the top of the spire's final set of stairs. Mass reactive rounds detonated by the dozen, bass thunderclaps punctuating the wet thump of tearing flesh. Writhing tentacles grasped at the Carcharodons, one sinuous length wrapping around the greaves of Beta 83 Rua and trying to drag him down towards a distended maw filled with needle teeth and grinning secondary mouths. The Carcharodon unlocked his combat knife, and in a silent rage, hacked the boneless limb apart, sawing the razor blade through the thick layers of purple flesh and rancid yellow fat. "Cease," Ikara ordered. It took a few moments for the words to register with Cordy, and a few more for him to stop his automatic fire. Around him, the rest of Fourth Squad likewise eased fingers from triggers. The demons were gone. The blast doors to the ship's bridge lay open before them. The inside stank of death. "Advance," Ikara ordered.
"Watch all angles,"
Teika Harangi added.
"and above."
The librarian's voice was terse, as though he was speaking through gritted teeth. Whatever his warp sight was showing him, it wasn't good. The Carcharodons secured the bridge in silence, alert for further contacts. There were none. Cordy scanned the darkness of the arching chamber's hanging rafters, hung with shadows. His mind saw an endless expanse of clear blue sky, mirroring the open waters below. He thrust the unwelcome memory angrily aside, turning his attention to the grisly remains of the corpses beneath his feet. They were a mixture of Imperial Navy bridge staff and Adeptus Arbites lawmen, united by a single aspect. They had been cut down with bolters, chain blades, and worse. It was the work of their dark brothers. That much was certain. Teika Harangi was standing on the edge of the bridge's primary vox pit, looking down at the carpet of Navy corpses and the body of a single female arbitrator. One headless corpse had been pinned to the vox hub.
"We are too late,"
the chief librarian said.
"They have all gone."
"Scythe 4, come in," said the voice of Company Master Shah over the vox. "Repeat. Scythe 4, come in."
"The bridge is secure,"
Teika Harangi said, before Akara could respond.
"They've already slaughtered the last prisoners. The murderers have done their work well. They've used Vox trickery and dark sorcery to infiltrate the system."
"We have found none of them in the Medicaid Bay either, but evidence of their dark rituals abound."
"The dead skin was on board. I can sense the lingering pain of his presence, like an aftershock."
"Where is he now?"
"Below the surface, hunting the boy. We must hurry."
"I will have Void Spear and Razortooth pick us up from the shuttle base, and Whitemore will destroy this hulk from afar. Send word to Ari to bring his initiates as well. They will accompany you once we reach the surface."
"With me, brethren,"
Teika Harangi said, addressing Fourth Squad. Cordy and the others closed around the ancient librarian as he departed for the Imperial Truth shuttle bays. Casting one last lingering look at the headless corpse pinned to the Vox Bay below. "All Void brethren." Shah's voice clicked over the company-wide Vox channel. "New objective coordinates uploading. Lock onto Imperial Surface Installation Gamma 83, tagged Sub-Precinct 8. Rannick looked at herself in the tiny mirror plate in Sub-Precinct 8's ablution cell. The face that stared back at her was nightmarish. The blood and gristle that had caked it flowed in pink lines where the arbitrator was trying to wash it away, plastering her dark hair to her scalp and stinging her eyes. Her hands shook as she splashed more water over her head. She told herself it was because of the cold, and not the fear that still gripped her. The arbitrators manning the walls reported that the shadows edging the tree line beyond the sub-precinct were moving. The rain had let up, giving way to pallid, watery sunlight, but the darkness beneath the boughs only seemed to have deepened. There had been no more gunfire. The headless corpse of the arbitrator, brought down trying to get Rannick inside, still lay in the churned-up mulch beyond the south gate. First Arbitrator Jaqen had briefed Rannick in the sub-precinct's small control room. Clen, the facility's commander, had departed for the session review the day before. Word had come through that the shock squads were being scrambled to investigate an unauthorized high-orbital entry. The garrison had been stood too. There had been a blurt of panicked, contradictory messages from the precinct fortress, and then nothing. That was when the darkness had started to encroach. In the hours before the dawn, Jaqen had triggered the sub-precinct's distress beacon and waited. They'd seen the re-entry of Rannick's salvation pod burning a trail through the morning sky and sent a team to investigate. The attack on them confirmed what Rannick had feared. The monsters had made it planetside. She hadn't spoken of them. She'd told Jaqen that the Imperial truth had been a trap, that the dark forces of the archenemy had come to Zartak, and that they may well be the only survivors still resisting. But she hadn't said anything of the towering, shrieking things that had fallen upon them from the darkness. How they had been impervious to a whole clip of Vox-Legi shells. How they had crushed skulls and snapped necks with the gleeful ease of a child at play. She certainly hadn't told them how one, his midnight blue armor splattered with Macran's blood, had not only spared her, but returned her planetside via the salvation pod. The memory made her want to be sick again. She didn't know why she'd been saved. Was she tainted? Had some sort of corruption been planted in her soul? She gripped the sides of the sink, head bowed, trying to stop shaking, watching the pink water swill down the plug hole. Jaqen wanted to kill the convicts. Rannick had refused, not because she considered it the wrong thing to do, but because she simply hadn't known what to do. Nothing in her progenium training had prepared her for this. The ablution cell had been part of Clen's private quarters. Rannick had been at loggerheads with the older sub-warden from the day she had arrived on Zartak, but she'd have given anything right then to have him present. She wondered what had happened to her own sub-precinct, to First Arbitrator Nellis and the rest of her men, and what had become of the precinct fortress. What was she supposed to do next? Send a force to investigate? Hold tight and watch the shadows creep closer? The memory of the slaughter on board the Imperial Truth returned, and she shuddered. "Sub-Warden Rannick, sir," called Jaqen from outside the cell's hatch. "The Augur is detecting an entry approach from orbit. 2 signals, both Imperial, but the identification isn't coming up in the databanks. Also, we're getting returns on a large detonation in high orbit. We suspect a ship has just been destroyed." "I'll be right there," Rannick replied, cuffing water from her face. Looking at her pale, red-eyed reflection, she felt a sudden bout of anger. She was an officer of the Adeptus Arbites. Regardless of the fate that had befallen the rest of Zartak, the situation in Sub-Precinct 8 was stable. It was her duty to keep it that way until the Imperium finally realized what was happening, and help arrived, whenever that might be. She tugged her carapace plate straight, scooped her newly requisitioned helmet from the bare rockcrete floor, and opened the hatch. Jaqen was waiting for her. "Prime the aerial defense batteries," she ordered the first arbitrator. "They could be from the Imperial Truth, which means they're not ours anymore." "Sir, they don't appear to be from the prison ship," Jaqen replied. "They check out as some sort of gunship, of a much older pattern." "Do we have visuals?" "Yes, sir." Rannick strode out into the dirt parade ground set before the sub-precinct central keep. The garrison were manning the walls of the rockcrete bastions that ringed the central block. The multi-barreled Hydra flak cannons that crowned the keep's roof were inert, their servitor targeting systems not locking on to the friendly signal being broadcast by the approaching flyers. Rannick took the magnoculars handed to her by Jaqen. Whatever they were, the aircraft certainly didn't look friendly. The viewfinder's enhanced scopes stripped away the distance and cloud cover to reveal 2 heavy-looking snub-nosed gunships streaking towards the sub-precinct, the pallid sunlight glinting from their stubby, grey-plated wings and the barrels of their bristling weaponry. As Rannick watched, one stooped to begin what could only be a descent run, while the other held off in a holding pattern. "Lock the hydras," Rannick told Jaqen. "But don't fire unless they fire first, or I give the order. Is that clear?"
Yes, sir.
The scream of distant engines rose to a painful pitch. Rannick clamped the magnoculars and tried to ignore the churning in her stomach. As it drew closer, she realized just how monstrously large the descending gunship was. Armor-plated and heavily armed, whatever it was, Jaqen was right. It hadn't come from the Imperial truth. There was a rattle as the autocannon emplacements on the outer bastions tracked the flyer. Its landing prongs extended beneath it. Rannick backed up against the keep's blast doors to make room as it lowered itself onto the parade square, the downdraft of its shrieking engines battering at her. The arbitrators on the surrounding walls stood ready, shotguns and auto-rifles raised. Rannick pulled on her helmet, her mouth set in a grim downward turn. There was a thump as the gunship landed, settling with leaden grace. The engine noise cut back to an idling whine, and then clattered out altogether. The sudden silence seemed to press in on Rannick. Her skin crawled. The heavy front hatch of the gunship directly faced her, as did its black-tinted cockpit and the gaping maw of the cannon that ran along its upper spine. The arbitrators waited. Eventually, there came the thud of disengaging maglocks and a hydraulic whir as the front hatch began to lower. Bursts of pressurized steam obscured Rannick's view of whatever lurked within. She realized, abruptly, that she was probably about to die. The thump of heavy footfalls echoed out across the square. A shadow materialized from within the gunship's depths. Rannick froze, terror stopping her hand on the butt of her auto-pistol. It was the same creature that had been on the Imperial Truth. A giant in vast plates of armor. It strode towards Rannick like a colossus, steam wreathing it, its glaring, soulless black lenses pinning her against the keep's rockcrete. And yet, something was different. This time, the warrior titan was not armored in darkest blue, but in grey. Gone were the leering skulls and crimson wing sigils, replaced by a coiling white oceanic predator. In its monstrous fists, it carried a huge chain axe, its rotor silent and inactive. It halted at the foot of the ramp. More hulking warriors emerged behind it, spreading out in a semicircle on either side. They were similarly bedecked in grey and black battleplate, parts of it inscribed with strange swirling patterns. A few bore red diagonal lines down the visors of their helmets. Scrimshawed bone tokens and old, jagged-looking predator teeth clattered from leather bands bound around their vambraces and gorgets. Most carried huge bolt guns, though one bore a ragged strip of cloth aloft on a pole, all of it faded to obscurity bar a central white crest that mirrored the one on each of the warrior's right pauldron. None of the arbitrators moved. Rannick stared. She knew one wrong twitch would see her smeared against the wall of the keep by a storm of mass-reactive bolts. The first giant to emerge from the gunship, the one with the chain axe, stepped forwards.
"Hail, Imperial citizen."
The voice was a dry, deep rasp, crackling up from the helmet's vox grill as though from a great depth. Rannick took a moment to realize the giant was speaking in High Gothic. She cast about for a response, striving to recall her progenium days in Abbot Tarwell's bitterly cold lingua chamber. "Who are you?" she asked, knowing she was horribly mangling the translation from low to high.
"We're the Carcharodon on Astra, servants of the Void Father and the Imperium. We come to your world seeking a red tithe, as is our right, granted by the Forgotten One on the day of exile."
Rannick picked up only one prominent part of the giant's words. They served the Imperium. The revelation didn't do much to ease her fear. Nothing lately had been as it seemed.
"We detected your distress signal,"
the giant continued when Rannick didn't respond.
"A war band of vile traitors and heretics have beset your world and already murdered many of your brethren. We will assist you with their destruction before we claim our tithe."
"You are here to help us?" Rannick asked haltingly. The giant paused before replying, as though considering her words.
"Yes," he said eventually.
We require full access to this facility, for use as a staging ground. There are more of you. Is the perimeter secure? The giant asked, ignoring the question. Yes. We've had contacts, though. We shall begin our deployment. Praise the Void Father, citizen, for the Red Tithe has begun. Shah had forgotten how pathetic humans were.
The one before him was clearly stunned at the sight of 2 squads of Adeptus Astartes, her half-helm failing to hide her slack jaw. The company master blink-clicked his visor's internal Vox uplink icon. "Brother Attica, bring Void Spear down," he said. "Affirmative, company master," the Thunderhawk pilot replied. "Our scanners are detecting contacts beyond the perimeter of the facility." "I'm aware," Shah said. "Proceed regardless. We have no time to lose." The human was saying something, her high Gothic phrases largely incoherent. Shah interrupted her. "This facility holds penal laborers?" The human managed to nod. Shah continued. "You will show them to me and my chief librarian when he arrives." It had been almost half a decade since Shah had last spoken to a human that wasn't a chapter serf. The one before him looked no older than a child. From a glance, he knew the rest of the garrison were older, but they hardly looked more competent. There was no chance they'd managed to resist the traitors on their own merit thus far. They'd simply been left alive, unknowingly at the mercy of the invaders. That meant the traitors had wanted the Carcharodons to land here. Void Spear touched down beside Razortooth, the twin Thunderhawk gunships filling the small parade ground. Te Kaharangi led strike leader Ari out to join 1st and 2nd squads, assembled around Shah. The terror emanating from the human before them became even more palpable at the sight of the blue-armored chief librarian.
"Well met, Sub-Warden Rannick,"
Te Kaharangi said. The human blanched. "You know my name?" "My brother knows many things," Shah said, tiring of the young human's stupidity. "It is best not to question them. Now, you will show us to your detention center. I must review your prisoners." The human Te Kaharangi had called Rannick hesitated, but not for long. She opened the central keep's blast doors and led them down into its vaults. As they went, Shah ordered the rest of the assembled squads to join the garrison on the ramparts, while Void Spear and Razortooth took to the sky once more. If their dark brethren were planning to strike any time soon, they would not be caught unprepared. A gravlift took them down to the prison vaults. They had been carved into the bedrock of Zartak itself. The corridors were of jagged, damp stone, and stalactites bristled from the low ceiling. The inmate cells had been burrowed from the rock and sealed off with heavy plasteel bars and grates. Shah and Te Kaharangi passed through the vault corridors, Rannick following like a child in the footsteps of adults. After a period of silence, Shah spoke to his chief librarian. "Are they suitable?" Te Kaharangi made a dry, grunting noise, not looking at the company master.
"They are terrified. A pall of fear has fallen across this world. The influence of the dead skin lies over everything."
"And when we have killed him and banished his darkness?"
"It is hard to say. They are malnourished, overworked. Many already bear crippling injuries. Few are fit for the slave decks, let alone indoctrination."
"We will take what we can," Shah said. "Sift this place for anything that might benefit the chapter."
"I am only here for the boy,"
Te Kaharangi said. "He is worth that much to you?"
"You know as well as I how difficult it is to find new initiates for the librarium. In the outer dark, beyond the usual means of recruitment, discovering a suitable young psyker is hard enough. Finding one who is largely untainted is nearly impossible. My brother librarians have waited decades for this day to come. That is why I am here."
"And I will assist you," Shah reassured him, "as far as my duties will permit."
"We shall see just how far that really is,"
Te Kaharangi said. Occasionally, as they walked, he would pause to peer into one of the cells. The inmates within would gasp or cry out at the sight of the towering warrior. They were universally a bedraggled set of creatures, their grey overalls stained by layers of sweat and dirt, their exposed flesh caked with grime. Shah wondered whether he had looked in any way similar to them before his own induction. Wondered whether he had shared these very same cells. Such memories were long lost to him now.
"What is the average survival rate for these wretches?"
he asked Rannick, gesturing through the bars of one of the cell grates. The convicts inside moaned with fear. "From when they first arrive," Rannick replied in her pidgin high Gothic. 9 to 10 months. Terran standard. Even the slave berths of the Nomad Predation Fleet did not have such a high rate of attrition, Shah thought. Still, it was better than nothing. "Do you know the boy's location?"
he asked Teika Harangi over the internal vox.
Approximately,
The chief librarian said.
he has allowed me into his mind to an extent, though the strain is great. I have traced his warp presence to a subsection of the primary prison mine. It is on the other side of the hemisphere. There are a number of access points on the jungle surface I could use.
The traitors have allowed us to get this far, Shah said. This entire place reeks of a trap.
Regardless, you are out of time, Company Master,
Teika Harangi said.
Kahu will brook no delay for the tithing, and I must reach the boy. The dead skin draws nearer to him with each passing moment. I have been able to keep him moving thus far, but I can only do so much from a distance. I must go in person and retrieve him.
Then do so, Shah said. Take Ari and his 10th Company initiates aboard a Void Spear, and go with all haste. May the Void Father guide you. Teika Harangi bowed his head.
What will you do in the meantime?
We're going to start, the Company Master said, by purging the heretics. Once they have been uprooted, we can collect the prison inmates and shuttle them into orbit. Teika Harangi stopped, assessing the rugged cell corridor and the heavy prison doors. His helm swung to face Shah, its intricately inscribed blue plates and black lenses inscrutable.
Do you remember this place, Company Master?
Shah paused for a moment, taking in Zartak's gloomy tunnels before replying, No, Pale Nomad. It is nothing to me. Teika Harangi shook his head.
You are lying, Pale Shah.
Vorfex crouched on the edge of the jungle tree line and bared his fangs. The air above the little precinct fort was vibrating with the shriek of engines and the passage of heavy gunships. The Loyalists were deploying more of their forces to the surface. Vorfex estimated almost a full company's strength. His raptor claw had come down from the Imperial Truth on Kull's orders, not long after Vorfex had jettisoned the unconscious Imperial in the Salvation Pod, and just in time to avoid the ship's destruction at the hands of the newly arrived Loyalist fleet. Since then, they'd been stalking the sub-precinct from the jungle edge, like half-glimpsed predators circling trapped prey flesh. They'd made their presence known with the occasional shot from across the clearing, teasing the Imperials with little doses of terror. Vorfex had just started to contemplate a small murder raid, contrary to orders, when the Auspex had detected incoming flyers. Suddenly, everything became interesting again. Kull had been right, damn him. There were Loyalist Adeptus Astartes arriving on Zartak. Vorfex hadn't recognized their grey and black heraldry, though their predator crest had sent a thrill of excitement through the Night Lord's gen-hanced veins. The harvest had gone from a mission of murder and pillage to an opportunity for them to prove that the 8th Legion was still the deadliest band of hunter-killers in the galaxy. And that was the perfect setting for him to assume leadership of the warband. The Loyalists had already announced their presence by boarding and destroying the Imperial Truth. It had happened while the shuttle carrying Vorfex's Raptor Claw was still descending from orbit. He'd watched grainy images from the rear Pictcaster as the prison ship buckled and split apart beneath the firepower of the newly arrived Imperial fleet. The flayed father would be incensed that the death-haunted ship had been wrecked, just when he was close to finishing its transformation into his own little pain-racked warp nest. Vorfex didn't care. He despised the trickery of the Dark Gods almost as much as he hated the weakling lapdog Imperials. There was only one will in the galaxy he obeyed, and that was his own. Another gunship rose from within the sub-precinct's outer walls and burned away to the north. The Claw leader opened a vox channel to the precinct fortress. My prince, this is Vorfex. They're still deploying at the point you predicted. Armor has started to arrive. I estimate a company-sized force. No more, no less. Kull's voice crackled back over the uplink. Understood. Watch then, brother. Only withdraw if threatened. The Claw is hungry, my prince, Vorfex said, testing Kull's limits. It matters nothing to me what your Claw desires, Vorfex. Soon, we will all hunt. If you cannot hold position and keep your Claw in check, I will find a champion who can. Is that clear? Yes, my prince, Vorfex lied, battling to keep the resentment from his voice. He broke the link. The Claws were returning to their new home. They came with the subsurface loco carriages, packed with terrified meat. From all of the outlying sub-precincts and secondary mines, the Night Lords assembled and brought their fresh prisoners. The new arrivals were unloaded en masse into the burrow to join the remaining Sinkshaft 1 inmates still competing for survival among the haunted tunnels and pits. The Night Lord's fleet had withdrawn from the dark side of Zartak to the cover of the asteroid belt. The warband was assembled beneath the surface in its entirety. The last remnants shuttled down just before the Loyalists arrived. Now, they need only wait. The Imperials holed up in the last defended sub-precinct had sealed off the subterranean routes linking their smaller mine works to the larger ones of the burrow. Karl watched via the view screens as the separating blast doors ground slowly open. The first armored figures emerged through them, bolters at the ready, moving with the lethal fluidity of born predators. The Night Lord grinned to himself. Soon, they would discover who the real predators on Zartak were. He activated his Vox and opened a channel to the whole warband. "This is the Prince of Thorns, to all claws," he said. "You may begin." Gene scan complete. Access granted. Beginning Membank entry log. Date check. 3644875.M41. Day 79. Warp time variance approximate. We have reached the waypoint station at Gorgas, following the path of the rogue penal ship. Progress has been slow. The tides of the Empyrean are against us, and I fear we shall arrive on Zartak after whatever events currently unfolding there have ended. Quite what we will find, only the God Emperor knows. I have used the opportunity afforded by the brief break back into real space to contact superiors and subordinates alike. Rochfort has finally been able to conclude matters on Kelliston. My Lord Rosencrantz is still urging haste. I informed him of the mystery of the missing colonists on Zartak, and forwarded him copies of the files I have thus far compiled from the St. Angelica's limited databanks. Hopefully his higher clearance levels and access to the Ordo Librarium on Midqual will give him a better chance of discovering the truth behind these strange events. We are poised now to return to the warp. Before us lies the edge of Imperial void space, and beyond it, black, endless nothingness. I am starting to regret the glee with which I accepted this assignment. Signed, Interrogator Orgim and Zogwu. Membank entry log ends. Thought for the day. A life led in fear is a blessed life indeed. Chapter 7. It began with the Stalk. The Claws had come together in the network of mines spreading out from Sinkshaft 1 before shutting down all of their armor's secondary systems. The bitter red glow of helm lenses faded, and the arco lightning that snapped and crackled across the warplate of the veterans shorted out. They melded with the Stygian darkness, only the faintest whirring of dampened servos betraying the silence. Truly, they had become the night. Vorfex and his raptors had crouched amidst the dirt and the undergrowth of the surface for long enough. Damn Karl and his arrogant orders. The raptors needed to kill. The meat they'd been fed on the bridge of the Imperial Truth had been a pathetic morsel, and the fact that Vorfex had been forced to save the life of one of the corpse worshippers still rankled. He would achieve nothing on the surface. So his claw had descended into the darkness to join their brothers. There were none more adept at the art of the hunt than his raptors. They joined the Stalk, the first of 3 combat phases that the warband had long ago perfected. Slowly and patiently, the Night Lords located their enemies' positions and moved to encircle them, slipping through the shadows with the unhurried precision that spoke of complete self-confidence. After they were in position, the terror would begin. The flare of arco lightning, the screams of 1,000 victims, the bark and hammer of weaponry, Vox scramblers, distortion blasts, and stun grenades. They would flay the minds of their enemies in a burst of purest, maddening terror. Only then would they move in for the final, sweetest phase. The kill. Vorfex smiled as he reviewed the location of his brethren in the darkness around him. They would make prey out of those who believed themselves predators.
Area secured.
Strike Leader Neurotona's voice crackled over the Vox.
Junction 9-3 is clear.
Acknowledged, Shah replied. Hold position. We're joining you. The tactical brethren of 3rd Company's 2nd Squad had led the descent into the tunnels linking the sub-precinct to the primary mine works. They had encountered no sign of any enemy presence. Naratona had halted their advance at a subway intersection, the single largest point connecting the two underground networks. Shah had received a Vox message from Teika Harangi moments earlier that he too had begun to descend into the underground, far to the north. The company's scout detachment was fanning out ahead of him, splitting up to hunt for the boy. That was no longer Shah's concern. The primary mine had to be purged, and as quickly as possible. Only then